All right, I want to do a video on a classic copper john. Usually when I do these, I kind of show you the finished product here before I get started, but I don't see that on my desk. I buried it. So hopefully you know what a classic copper john looks like. It's also in the thumbnail for the video, so you should be able to see what we should end up with here. All right, in the vise, that's a size 14 curved nymph hook with a gold tungsten bead and some .020 lead-free wire. I'm going to tie this using some black UTC, and I'm going to kind of go over some of the things that I do to make this look the way that I want it to look and what I think is really important. The first thing is I get my thread started here behind the weight. I'm also going to go back up into the weight and run some thread wraps inside those gaps. As I've said in some of my other videos, I don't understand the glue. Glue is fine. I don't fault people for using glue, but it really just doesn't serve a purpose. You don't really have to worry about glue. Wrapping your thread right in there like that will secure that, no problem at all. It'll never go anywhere or move on you or anything. The one thing that I do want to point out that I think is of the utmost importance here is the thread that I'm using. If you want to tie a nice clean copper john that fits together the way you want, the one thing I think is non-negotiable is you got to have a flat thread. The flat thread is what's going to lay flat on the hook, create a nice smooth underbody. It's gonna make it so that when you wrap that wire, you're not going to be in a position where, you know, it's all over the place and all. It's going to be nice and firm where you want it to be, and that's exactly what you're looking for. You can kind of see how right here, see how my thread is kind of splaying out. That means that it's where it's supposed to be and laying nice and flat. So as you turn your thread more and more, your thread is going to spin. Now I just spun my bobbin and you can see how it's kind of flat or kind of twisted up now. You want to try to avoid that. Although right now I'm going to keep it twisted because I like to put a little thread ball at the bottom of my flies. And it just kind of helps splay out the biots a little bit. You don't really need to do this, but I do it on my stonefly patterns and my copper johns. So I'm just going to add a tiny little bit, tiniest little speck of Solares right there. We'll get that cured up. Now, while I'm doing this, I know you probably can't see it, but my bobbin right now is just spinning on its own. And that's an important thing to understand, because if it's spinning, my thread is not in a position where it's going to lay flat right now. So once you do a few wraps, if you need to flatten your thread back out, what you can do is just see which way it naturally wants to spin, and then spin it until you see that it's going to be flat again up here. All right, now I've got that little piece of Solares there. Now I'm just taking a duck quill and taking the biots off the top of the duck quill, and I'm going to tie those in for the tail. And I've also said many times, I tie all of my biot tails in one by one, and I actually kind of envy a lot of those tiers out there that just put them both on, wrap the thread, and boom, they're done. I've never really been able to do that. I've never really been able to master that. It's really cool when you see it done. I haven't been able to do that. And I also want to point out again, the fact that I'm using these duck biots. The copper john is one of the flies that I probably see more than any other fly just tied. I don't know if I want to use the word incorrectly. I don't know if incorrectly is really what I'm thinking about. They're certainly not tied very cleanly. One of the biggest things that I see is the bumpy wraps of wire, which I'm going to show you how to get away from that. But I also see way oversized biots. That's another thing too. So the goose biots, I know that's kind of the standard in nymphs, but really honestly, they're a little too big. So the duck biots will give you an entire quill of properly sized tailing material. So I take duck biots over goose biots any day. Next thing I'm going to tie in is I'm going to tie in some of this copper wire in brassie size. This is a size 14 fly, so brassie is what I want to see. And again, my bobbin is spinning on its own, and I'm going to help it in that direction until I see my thread kind of laying flat. And right about there. So I'm going to get that wire tied in, get it secured, pull it back where I want it. Now, as I tie this in, I'm going to go about 1/4 of the way down, and then I'm going to double back. And what I'm doing as I'm tying this wire in, I'm building a taper for my fly. And I'm going to flatten out my thread again, and I'm going to go back down. Now watch, right now, see how that thread is flat right where it meets the hook? The more I wrap it, the more you're going to see that that is going to start to coil up. See, now it's a little less flat, so I'm going to just give my bobbin a little bit of a counterclockwise spin to get it flat again. And then I'm going to go back up towards the top. The more wraps you take with your thread not laying flat, the more you're going to create a bumpy, uneven underbody, and that's what's going to make your wire look kind of crappy and all over the place. So you want to avoid that as much as possible. And making sure that your thread is nice and flat when you wrap it will pretty much eliminate that from happening. Give that another good spin. If you feel like you've spun it too much, just completely stop and let your thread do what it wants to do. Now my thread is going back clockwise right now, so I can tell that I spun it a little too much. So I'm going to get that back to where it's kind of flat. And I don't know if I'm missing the spot or not, but it just seems to... still seems coiled up. It wants to spin counterclockwise, so I'm gonna give that a nice spin. That's about as good as we're gonna get right there. So now I'm gonna take that, bring it all the way down to where my tail is, right up to where I tied those biots in. And then I'm gonna bring my... Yeah, see, I don't like that. I got a little hasty there, and my thread was not laying flat. There we go. So now we'll do nice flat touching wraps all the way up. Okay, now you can kind of see how smooth that body is. Another thing that you can do too, I don't know how many of you guys are rod builders, but even if you're not, this tool here is called a thread burnisher. It's a big thing for rod builders. I've got a couple of them. They're only like $2, so you can go get one of these too. And all you're going to do is take that end and just rub it on the thread. And what that'll do is it'll get a lot of those little individual fibers to kind of sit down inside any gaps that might be there, and it'll flatten out and make that nice and smooth. So you can also invest in one of those too if you like. So now I'm just going to take this, go right over the top with a nice firm wrap to get me started. And I'm going to apply a little back pressure, meaning I'm going to kind of angle my wrap towards the back of the fly to make sure that it sits nice and cleanly up against the previous wrap. And I'm just going to continue with that back pressure as I wrap this all the way up the body. And you should see that you're going to get some nice, clean, touching wraps. You know, and as I said a million times before, you know, when you try to tie a fly nice and clean like this, it's not always a measure of effectiveness. I mean, obviously, you know, fish aren't going to look at it and be like, wow, there's a bumpy underbody, I'm not going to eat that. You know, they don't care. But I will say, and I've held true to this since the day I started fly fishing, I am and have always been a big believer in confidence flies. Even if I'm fishing something that doesn't really match up with what's actually hatching or anything like that, if I have a fly that I feel confident in, whether that be something I've caught fish on before or something where I'm happy how I tied it, it really doesn't matter what it is. If I'm confident in that fly, I'm going to fish it more attentively, I'm going to fish it more confidently, and I think that that's going to bring more fish to the net. It's just the way that I've always thought. So yes, it is true that a nice cleanly tied fly is not really going to make much of a difference to the fish, but it will make a difference to the confidence level of the fisherman and how intently they're fishing it. But again, that's just my belief. It's the way I've always been. So now I'm just securing this, and when I get a few wraps in, I'm just going to helicopter that and break that right off. And we're good. Okay, so the only order of business now is let's get this thorax built up. So I do want to have a little bit of flash on this, so I got a strip of this tinsel here. And if you want the tinsel to lay on the top of your wing case, then this has to be the first thing that you tie down. So I'm going to get that down with a nice loose wrap, and then I'm going to center it as I wrap back. Now the next thing, I couldn't find my nymph skin, which is what I normally use. This is some black scud back. You can use nymph skin, you can use scud back, you can use Swiss straw. You know, you got a lot of options for what you can use for the wing case on this thing. I don't mind the scud back. I do prefer the nymph skins. It's just got a little bit more mass to it, I guess you can say. But this will work just fine. I'm going to get those two materials tied in, and we're good. Next order of business is the thorax material, which I'm going to pull from a peacock eye here. And I'm going to pull 2 strands from just below the eye. And I want the fibers to kind of lay facing the rear of the fly. So what I'm going to do to make that happen is I'm going to tie these in by the tips. I'll tie them in by the tips. Get those all set. Break those right off. Those tips are so brittle, you don't need to cut them. And I'm just going to take these, and I'm just going to wrap them with touching wraps all the way up to my bead. Probably should have pulled 3 fibers, but nah, this will work just fine. When I get to the bead, I like to make sure I get a wrap right up to the bead. And that looks like a nice full thorax. That's kind of what we're looking for. A few loose wraps and we can get that snipped off. Now for the legs, I went in and I grabbed a brown partridge feather. And this is kind of what I did to it. I went in and I notched out the middle, which is how I tie in all my legs. So I'm going to take the one side and pinch that down, pinch down the other side, get it sized up, and try to get those legs squeezed onto the side of the hook where I can get a wrap on there and secure them. I do sometimes tie them in one side at a time. See, this isn't cooperating, so I'm going to do it one side at a time. If I get a feather that lays nice and flat and doesn't give me any problems, I will do it the way that I just tried to do it, where I get both sides in at once. But that doesn't always happen, so if it's giving me some crap, I will do it like this. Okay, so there's one side in. I'm going to pull that out to size it the way that I want. That'll do right there. And then I get the other side lined up. The back side's usually easier because you can grip it a little bit better. So I'm going to angle that where I want it. Pull it to size, and we're good right there. Get that cinched in there. One in front. And goodbye. So now it's just a matter of getting the wing case folded over. Get that up over the top. That'll also help splay out our legs too. And then on the second wrap, I'm going to get my tinsel tied down. I got pretty much everything secured here. Did a couple of wraps, fold it back, get a wrap in front of the bead, and let's get all this out of there. I don't like how these legs on the back side are splaying, but whatever. Alright, I'm going to get a little whip finish in here. Get that secured and tied off. And the final step of this process is we're going to get a little bit of this Solares, and this is the thicker viscosity here. I know there's I see a lot of questions out there about what type of resin to use. If you're doing wing cases or something like that, you want something with a little bit of a thicker viscosity. If you're doing something like covering a quill body, you want thinner. So wing case thick, body thin. It's a little too much. Let me back a little bit off of there. Just gonna spin that, and that'll pull some off. Just another little dab here in front, even that out. And that looks about where I want it. Kill the lights. Let's get a blast on that. I don't know what kind of UV torch you're using. I always used a small little torch, but I've recently switched over to this Solares torch, and man, is there a difference. Much more power. Cures things up much better. I used to have to leave my nymphs in the window for a little while, but this one is, I don't have to do that anymore with this torch. And that is it. That is your classic Copper John. Make sure that you're using a flat thread. That will help give you a nice little flat underbody to make sure that those wire wraps are nice and straight. That'll get rid of all that bumpiness in the body. A lot of little things there. I mean, that's the way I like them to come out. If you have any questions or anything, just throw them in the comments. I'll be more than happy to help out in any area that I can, but make sure you're using a flat thread. And I'm telling you, those duck biots better catch on. I just don't see enough people tying with duck biots. They're still sticking with goose, and I'm seeing a lot of those oversized tails. That's about the tail that you want right there. I mean, you've never seen a mayfly with big, huge, massive, bushy tails. So go with a duck biot. I think you're gonna like those a lot better than the goose. So, any questions or anything, just throw them in the comments. I try to respond to any of them that I see, and go from there. Appreciate it.